pain to whispers of the witching hour. As the veil between worlds grows thin, join us in the shadows where ancient secrets and forgotten spells await. Tonight, we delve into the mysteries of the unseen, where every whisper carries the weight of centuries and every shadow hides a story. Light your candles, cast your circles, and prepare to be enchanted. The witching hour is upon us. Dare you listen? Welcome, seek.
Hello guys, welcome back from last week. We are on to part 2 of the 6-part episodes for the spiritualism movement in the early 1900s. I'm going to draw a card for our episode today. How's everybody doing? Okay, what do we got? Fitting. We have the Temperance card. It's for balance, harmony, moderation, patience, which is ironic, being sensible, purpose, and finding meaning. And the reason why it's ironic is because this is the part 2 of our 6-part series on the spiritualism movement in the early 1900s. In the last episode, we talked about Pearl Curran and Patience Worth. Pearl Curran is the lady that last episode we talked about Pearl Curran and Patience Worth. Pearl Curran is the lady that channeled Patience Worth through a spirit board, and they end up channeled Patience Worth through a spirit board, and they end up writing several books. As a follow-up to our episode from last week, they end up writing several books. As a follow-up to our episode from last week, we had a couple questions that I didn't quite have the answers to, so I would like to get into some of those answers. The first question was, why is it frowned upon? Why can't you, or why shouldn't you look through the eye of a planchette? Essentially, it's pretty much just chalked up to being a way to invite unwanted spiritual or supernatural influences. It's a superstition, essentially. You shouldn't look into a planchette, essentially, because you're then inviting these spirits not just to communicate with you through the spirit board, but like to inhabit you as the person versus just the board. So the second question from last week was, how did the board name itself? And there's still, it's still kind of muddy. There isn't really a whole lot, other than in the initial session with the board that Elijah Bond had created, that first session that him and his friend Charles Keenard asked the board what it should be called. Its response was Ouija. The understanding is there's like three different philosophies on this. The first one being spiritual. The spirit present at the time of that channeling supplied the name, and the assumption is that that name was given to the spirit through higher means. So maybe the spirit board did name itself. Subconsciously, there is a thing called the idiometer effect. It's the involuntary movements of your hands that are not conscious thought, like subconscious movements that you're unaware that you're doing. Is why a lot of people don't believe in pendulum divination because your hand can influence the way that the pendulum swings through the idiometer effect. And then the third is going to be the historical reasoning why the board is named what it's named. Ouija could be inspired by the Egyptian word for good luck, or it's a combination of the French and German words yes. So oui is French for yes, and ja is German for yes. So Ouija is yes. And then the last question that was asked was, why was Pearl so willing to spend so much of her time writing these books for patients? And who brought up the partnership? Was it Patience or was it Pearl? So Pearl was initially fascinated by the messages that she was receiving from Patience. But initially she held on to like a little bit of indifference to working with Patience as like an actual partnership. She had to be coaxed by her friend Emily Grant Hutchins, who was with Pearl a lot of times when she was doing these divinations. She participated in several of her initial experiences with the spirit board. So it was her friend Emily that coaxed her into working with Patience long term. It doesn't say whose idea it was to write the books, just that these books got written. And that led me down some of the other notes that we had taken from that first episode. And we were talking about how long do you think it would take for an individual to write a book letter by letter through divination? Some of her books took only a year. Some of them took a lot longer. And then it is said later on in their working together, mind you, Pearl and Patience worked together for 20 years, for 2 decades. So towards the end of that partnership, before Pearl passed away, it was said that Pearl was so in tune with the way that Patience gave her information and with her writing style that she didn't even need the spirit board to communicate with her. It was essentially just done through automatic writing with her typewriter. There wasn't even a spirit board or planchette or anything like that that was used for the communication. It was just Pearl with the typewriter, and she was typing out these supposed communications from Patience. So those were the answers to some of the questions from last week's episode. This week we are going to go a little bit further. Just as a reminder, the spiritualism movement of the early 1900s gained momentum mid-19th century and continued into the early 20th century. It was not just a spiritual movement, it was a religious and a social movement centered around the belief that the spirits of the dead could communicate with the living. So it wasn't just spirit board, it wasn't just Ouija, it was other forms of communication as well. Spiritualists often believed that it was possible to communicate with the deceased through mediums who acted as intermediaries between the living and the spiritual world. So outside of a spirit board, you think of several different cultural representations in movies where you have a seance room. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have a Ouija board, but there could be a medium that was there performing mediumship, and a medium is the individual who has firsthand communication with the spirit and then relays that information to the receiver of the information, right? In the afterlife, the movement held that afterlife was a very dynamic place where spirits continued to evolve and interact with each other. This belief in and of itself led to the idea that spirits could offer guidance on moral and ethical issues, not just this is where I lost my ring at, you can go find it now, or this is what happened on this particular date and I remember this particular thing to prove that this medium is talking to the spirit of a lost loved one. But it was believed that they had the ability to give higher knowledge on moral and ethical issues as well. And with spirit guides, you think of like a medium or an individual who has the ability to read or understand divination. Spiritualists followed spirit guides, specific spirits that they relied on for spiritual direction and advice. So for Pearl Curran, it would very easily be stated that Patience Worth was her spirit guide, right? Because this is the individual that she is communicating with, that is communicating all this information to her for her to write out her books. Some individuals had more than one spirit guide. Some mediums claim to not have spirit guides at all, that they would just into information from a collective of individuals that were coming through in a particular reading. It was really popular, not just here in the United States, but pretty much all over the world in the mid-19th century, later on towards the early 20th century. But it gained momentum here in the United States, specifically in upstate New York. And the year that they give is 1840s, and the 1840s is kind of where that explosion of the spiritualism movement started, and it quickly spread to other English-speaking countries. But the start would really be 1840 in upstate New York. And the most popular means, like I said, was mediums and seances. Now, mediums conducted seances where participants would gather to communicate with spirits through various means, whether it was a Ouija board, a spirit board, through trance state mediumship, through table rapping, which was later on debunked as one of the easier ways to go about the spiritualism movement, make money off of. Some people, it's mostly frauds. Automatic writing. Automatic writing was a really big mean for individuals to communicate through actual writing.
To whispers of the witches.
Mostly because they would take a piece of paper and then they would just draw. And then all of a sudden, these words would start to appear, and that was the message. And it was mostly women that did the mediumship, the automatic writing, the seance rooms. Most of the time, that was run by women. That often, depending on where you were, there could be like variations in gender roles, right? So most of the people were women, but there were a few men, and the places where you would find men are going to be in the more sophisticated areas. Think of not the suburbs, not like these small little farm towns. We're talking large metropolitan areas, like Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, some of the larger towns in New England states. What now is Washington, D.C. was the province. Those were the areas where you're going to see the male mediumship, but mostly it was the women. And the reason why was most of these prominent spiritualists were women, and that aligned with other social issues or social causes, such as the abolition of slavery and the women's suffragette movement. Those particular things embodied women to be a little more vocal, outspoken, to go against the grain, because that there were other people that were fighting to get rid of certain laws, certain beliefs, or certain political stances. And we kind of touched on the fraud accusations on our last episode, right? So in the late 19th century, accusations of fraud by mediums led to a decline in the movement's credibility. It was kind of it was, I would say 50-50 in the beginning, but closer to the 19th century, it went to like a 70-30% split, where 70% of the individuals that you would run into or that you would reach out to or that would reach out to you were actually frauds. You had to go through several different chains in order to get a true medium or a true psychic or a true spiritualist who could divine some kind of accurate information that wasn't just broad spectrum information. That broad spectrum information being like some of these frauds would sit outside of like telegraph offices, and they would see or hear these telegraphs that were coming in of individuals who lost family members in the war, and then they would follow that telegraph officer to the location and say, okay, you know what, this individual, somebody in their house lost a family member in this war, let's give them a couple days. And then a couple days later, because they had all this previous information, they would go to that house and say, hey, sorry, I know this sounds really weird, but I think somebody is trying to reach you, and it might be your dead son or your dead nephew or your grandson or what have you. And these are the messages, and then just throw out whatever message that they would come up with. And the reason why they were so often believed is because this is a stranger, for one. You don't know this person from anywhere, and he's showing up at your house a couple days after you lose this loved one, and he's telling you that this individual who is now deceased, who you haven't had time to notify like the whole family, knows that this individual is deceased. Well, how would he know that this person is deceased if we haven't notified everybody? So he must be real. A lot of the skeptics believed that a lot of the mediums or fortune tellers or seance ships were trickery. They used trickery to deceive their audience, and that was one of those ways that was brought out after like the big wave of the spiritualism movement went through. There was a couple of these fakes that got caught, and they were like, hey, listen, we just swindled some people out of money. I get that. It's against the law. We committed a crime. But if we teach you the ways, if we teach you how other people are doing this, will you let us off the hook? So they basically became witnesses for the state to stop other forgeries or frauds that were in the mix, right? And that brought about some formal organizations that were on either side of the spectrum, right? So you had the law enforcement agencies that are like, okay, we need to stop these frauds, and then we have this organization that handles that. But then there were also organizations for the proven, the legitimate mediums or psychics or tellers or what have you, whatever name you want to give them, whatever their form of divination was. They had proven their worth and their credibility. So you have organization A, that these are the real people, and then you have organization B that's cracking down on these frauds, and then everybody else falls into category C. Either you haven't been proven, you're not good enough at what you're doing, you're not part of this elite group of people that are credible, or you are not a fraud. Like, there's so many people that fall into that C category, and most of the time those were frauds. Most of those times those were people that maybe they had a little bit of connection to the spiritual realm, but not enough for them to be classified as a true mystic. So they kind of fell through the cracks, and these people were essentially shunned. At the end of it, you have a group of individuals that are credible. They have proven their worth. They're not frauds. Their means can't be debunked. And it is such a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that has been reflected in a broad spectrum across multiple cultures, across multiple social changes of its time. And with this comes the realization that you're also going to attract individuals who might be notable to politics, to other forms of culture. You might have notable agriculture individuals, Hollywood starlets, maybe some playwrights, so like I said, politicians. So really quickly, we'll go over a couple of those individuals. So if you have Emanuel Swedenborg, who essentially was classified as the father of the spiritualism movement. He was a scientist, a philosopher, and a theologian, and that's quite a trio of titles, because it's unheard of almost in the 16, 17, 1800s to have a scientist who is also a theologian, right? So you either believe in the liturgy of theology, or you believe in science. Well, he was kind of both, but he was also a philosopher. So he posed the question, what if science and theology are one and the same? So he kind of initiated the spiritualism movement end of the 1700s. And he claimed to have communicated with spirits long before Patience Worth and Pearl Curran had their run. And it was said that he documented these mediumship episodes. I wasn't able to find like copies of any of the proof or the validation that he documented these actual things, but it's intriguing that he was not only a scientist, a philosopher, but also a theologian, and he kind of kicked off the spiritualism movement. The second set I did kind of touch on a little bit during the first episode, and it's the Fox sisters, FOX sisters, and it's Margaret and Kate Fox. And in 1848, the Fox sisters claimed to have communicated with spirits through rappings in their home in Hydesville, New York, and these demonstrations sparked widespread interest in spiritualism. It is thought that the one sister, when she would perform these rapping sessions, she would get legitimate responses, and it would terrify her. She'd be scared to death that this thing was happening and she couldn't control it, and she didn't understand the whys and the hows of it. But then her sister kind of had a little bit of jealousy, really, where when she would also perform these rappings, she would have like really extravagant showings of assumed spiritual encounters. It was later found that the one sister's spiritual encounters were very, very real, and the other sister's spiritual encounters were very much for show because she was jealous. Which, I mean, if you have a sister, you would know. That happens frequently. And then you go into politics, and you have an individual named Judge John W. Edmonds, and he was alive from 1816 to 1874. He was a prominent American judge who became a strong advocate for spiritualism after he witnessed the first Fox sisters' abilities. He then followed her through all of her different rapping sessions, and he ended up writing several books on the subject of rapping as a spiritual communication. And he supported the movement very, very publicly. It never seemed to affect his political career. It never affected his judgment with working with any of his legal cases. But he was a big supporter of Margaret Fox, which was the first sister who had these genuinely terrifying rapping sessions that scared her to death, and she didn't want to do it anymore. So the next person is going to be Justine Kerner, and she was alive from 1786 to 1862. She was a German poet and a physician who published the book The the Seeresses of Prevost. She detailed her experience with spiritual communications and magnetic healing. So she claims that this spirit came through and was telling her, hey, you can use magnets and you place them on these parts of the body and it will heal certain ailments. Well, they didn't really have the means to study whether or not it was real scientifically, and we know now that there are means of using magnets to heal or alleviate certain health issues, but they didn't have the ability to study it back then. She just went on with her blind faith and was like, okay, we're going to start healing people with magnets. And she had about 50-50 on, okay, it would work for some people but not for others, and again, they didn't have the means to study the different variables, but the people that were healed or cured through her magnets were very, very outspoken on the way that this worked, and she got this information from the spirits, which means that's divine, and it's phenomenal. Okay, so we're going to trust everything that she says or does from here on out. Kind of got her into trouble later on down the road with her career as a healer, but I digress. Another individual, okay, I absolutely love this name. He's an English electrical engineer. His name is Cromwell Fleetwood Varley. He was alive from 1825 to 1883. He investigated the phenomenon of table wrappings and later ended up having his own psychic experiences. But throughout his investigations, I mentioned earlier, it was later debunked that the majority of these table wrapping sessions were fake. They weren't real. That there were people, it was called knuckling, where the medium that would host these events would come in, and then there would be this other person, it was assumed was an assistant or a member of the audience or just some random individual, and he would have bolts in between his fingers, and when they would sit at the table, he would be the one to tap on these tables, giving the appearance that like something was actually happening, and it wasn't. It was, for the most part, very much plagiarized. It wasn't real. It was an easy way to scam people, essentially. Most table wrappers were scammers, and that's kind of the way of it, though. When you think about mediumship, is you're going to have your individuals who know what they're doing, know what they're talking about, and then you're going to have the people that are just trying to use people. So moving on to Maria Hayden, she was alive from 1825 to 1900s, right there in the thick of the early 1900s spiritualism movement. She was a medium, and she, time and time again, demonstrated her abilities to communicate with spirits using various means, whether it be through trance mediumship, through automatic writing, through using a Ouija board, using dowsing rods and pendulums. She faced a lot of opposition from the press and the clergy, but through the course of her demonstrations in the United States and in England over the course of 2+ decades, it was proven that almost all of her sessions were not faked. They were real. I don't know what means they used to prove this. I don't know what they used to say, okay, this is real and this wasn't, but they basically said her stuff was legit. And the last person that I have on our list of prominent figures is an individual named David Richmond, and he was alive from 1816 to 1891. And he was an Englishman who became a spiritualist while living in America and later established the first spiritualist church in England. So that's kind of spectacular. All of these individuals played a significant role in the development and spread of the spiritualism movement, and they contributed to its popularity and influence during the 19th century. Now, during the era of spiritualism movement, the cultural feelings towards those who claimed to be witches, seers, or mediums were, as one might assume, very, very mixed, right? There was acceptance and support. Within the spiritualist communities, mediums and seers were often respected and admired for their abilities to communicate with the spirit world. These individuals were seen as conduits for valuable spiritual guidance and comfort for individuals who were seeking solace from the loss of a loved one, which I can appreciate. That's, if you've ever lost somebody valuable to you and somebody comes along and says, hey, I have this ability, maybe I can help you communicate with them. Well, the well of hope that you thought was gone kind of springs back to life for a little while, and you might want to jump on that. And I'm sure some people but I'm sure some people were really, really grateful for the experiences that they did have. So in literary and in intellectual circles, some segments of society, particularly among intellectuals and literary circles, were fascinated by spiritualism and the claims of the mediums. They saw it as a new frontier, an exploration and a challenge to traditional religious beliefs and practices, because, let's face it, Abrahamic religion doesn't really like individuals thinking that they have access to the divine on a regular basis. But if the spiritualism movement were to prove anything, it was, regardless of what your religious belief is, there is at least some degree of connection to the other side if you choose to believe that. Along with the lack of belief, there you have the skeptics and the criticism that would come with anybody saying, hey, I have a connection to the divine. I think you can have this conversation with this person. And the religious opposition that came with that, as you would think, many mainstream religious groups viewed this spiritualism movement as suspicious and were quite hostile against it, for lack of a better word. And it equated to the witchcraft and the occult judgments, essentially. The church warned against the damages and the dangers of engaging with spirits and believed that these practices were heretical. It was blasphemous. You cannot go and fact check what the Bible says. You need to have blind faith and believe that this is what's going on. And if you believe that these mediums and the ability to communicate, whether you're using tarot cards or spirit board or the Ouija or whatever your form of divination is, if you believe that those are real, that you can divine information, then what's stopping you from fact-checking the Bible? Well, the church does not like that. And not just the church, but there was a plethora of public doubt as well. The skepticism that came from individuals in the public were mostly individuals who were deeply ingrained in the church, right? These are people that had deep-seated spiritual beliefs and unwavering faith. We don't need you questioning the Bible. We don't need to question the Bible, so you don't need to question the Bible, right? The authenticity of mediums and seers was highly doubted amongst these types of individuals, and they would say this is trickery, it's psychological warfare, or it's the idiometer effect, which, remember I stated before, is where if you're holding your hand like this, you have unconscious movements that are going to affect your divining ability, whether it be a planchette or sorry, my brain drew a blank. A pendulum. There we go. Within this time frame, you have the witch hunts and the persecution of seers and believers, right? In historical context, the infamous witch hunts primarily occurred from the 15th to the 17th century, well before the rise of the spiritualism in the 19th century. But these hunts were driven by a mix of religious fervor, social paranoia, political motivations, and it led to the persecution and execution of thousands of people. Again, mostly women. These were the types of people that also later on, after the witch hunt era between the 15th and the 17th century into the 19th century, it was the women, again, who claimed the spiritualism title, right? And you mix spiritualism with the witch hunts, and there was not really any widespread witch hunts specifically targeting the spiritualist and the individuals in the spiritualism movement, even though they did face opposition and criticism similar to that faced by the early practitioners of witchcraft and magic, not to the extent that they were hung or floated or lit on fire like we've seen with the witch trials in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. These spiritualists were accused of being frauds, were accused of being charlatans, and their practices were sometimes condemned by religious authorities. Modern perspective, really, you look at the cultural shift that's happened from the 19th century till now. Now, over time, the perception of witches, seers, mediums, whatever it is that you call yourself, it has evolved. Many people today currently view these roles with curious interest or openness at the very least. Even if they don't believe it for themselves, they're willing to look, they're willing to watch, to listen. They might have their own personal judgments, but they're not persecuting this individual who is claiming to be a medium, a spiritualist, a tarot reader, what have you. People are a little more open-minded, I think is the word that comes to mind. There is a vast and growing acceptance of the diverse spiritual practices that we see even nowadays on TikTok, on Facebook, in social media. We see a lot more openness to the diversity that is the umbrella of spiritualism and religious practices. So we touched on our last episode a little bit about the Ouija board and how the individual Elijah, he had essentially patented this spirit board and claimed to be the first individual that came up with it. And we learned that that's actually not the truth, that the earliest we have information on a Ouija board or a spirit board, or whatever title you want to give to this divination board, was in ancient China in the 1100 AD era in the Song dynasty. And it was known as planchette writing, which is where we get the name for the little device called the planchette. That's what brought about the question of, like, don't look through the eye of the planchette. It's a superstition. It's a superstition so that you don't invite something into you that you don't want. Unwanted spiritual interactions. The spiritualism movement in the late 19th century gained popularity in the United States when people believed that the dead could communicate with the living via these spirit boards that were used in seances to facilitate this particular communication. As mentioned, Elijah Bond, who is the individual that patented the first spirit board through the Kennard Novelty Company, his friend Charles Kennard was there at that first use of the Ouija board when they asked using the planchette, what should we name you? What are you called? And apparently the spirit of the board said Ouija. As previously mentioned, it's a combination of the word yes in French and the word yes in Russian. Oui in French is yes, and ja in Russian is, or Germanic, I'm sorry, not Russian, is yeah. So, did the board really name itself? We don't know. Maybe it didn't. Who knows? Again, there's not enough information out there on that particular session with the spirit board to say for certain this is what happened, this is how we know it was the board itself that named itself. But there's also too much information that could be to the contrary, that we have other languages that when you put these words together, it says something. Like I said, in Egyptian it means happy thought. So maybe it was somebody being clever, but the story goes the board named itself. The commercialization of it, the patent for it through the Cunard Company was patented in 1891. William Fuld, later the rights were acquired by William Fuld, who founded the Ouija Novelty Company and further popularized the board. Fuld's version of the board became the standard, though, and he is often credited with its widespread fame. So, while Elijah Bond patented the first Ouija board in the United States, it was later popularized by William Fuld, even though the original version of the spirit board dates clear back to the 1100 AD Song Dynasty in China. So it has a very widespread cultural connection across multiple companies, across multiple decades, centuries, across multiple people with multiple different names. And it's almost like we're never going to know the full accurate history of the board because there are so many iterations of where it originated, who created the design, who named the design, who patented it, who sold it, who made it popular. Was it William Fuld that made it popular, or was it the spiritualism movement of the 1900s? Or was it the fact that it was patented by Elijah Bond and it was sold to a larger company that made it popular? We'll never know because there's so many varying facts, so many various key elements that could have led to the rise of this particular thing. And it's so varied that it's really hard to pinpoint anything. The rise in popularity, though, can be funneled down to World War I. During and after World War I, as I mentioned before, individuals were seeking to connect with the lost loved ones, and then it grew even more later on after World War II, when individuals would lose sons, husbands, fathers, children, what have you. In the war, they sought out the comfort of connection of these individuals from their family that are no longer with them. And if they were promised the ability to communicate using this particular board, well, they're going to pay whatever they have to pay. They're going to sit down in a room in the dark with some candles and strangers whenever they can to have these communications with their loved ones. It's incredibly sad. Pearl Curran, as mentioned before, is another one of those key figures in the spiritualism movement. Her and Patience Worth wrote many books, initially using the Ouija board and then automatic writing, and then moved on to not even needing the divination element. They would just use a typewriter. And then over time, the Ouija board became more and more associated with the occult and paranormal activities that we see nowadays depicted in horror films or literature. the controversies that come up are, is it a spiritual item or is it a toy? Should it be considered a toy or a spiritual tool? While some people use them for fun and entertainment, others believe that these are serious means of communication with spirits. Yes. Yes. Both are going to be accurate, right? It just depends on who's using it and how they use it, right? Religious groups have multitude of religious concerns. Often, most religious groups condemn the use of Ouija boards, associating them with the divination and occult practices that's not very holy. They warn against using the board and say that it can invite negative spiritual influences or demonic possessions, which is ironic because right now on Amazon you can go type in the Jesus board and there is essentially a spirit board that claims you get a direct line to talk to Jesus. What? I mean, maybe if you believe that a spirit board is a tool for divination and can connect you to talk to spirits, then why can't the Abrahamic religions believe that they could also use this particular board to speak to their divine entities as well? Who am I to judge? But one of the bigger controversies was the fact that this thing, while it is being used by mediums and the spiritualists in society, it's being marketed to children. That's a question for ethics, not necessarily a good or a bad thing. Some people say that it shouldn't be marketed towards children as it is going to expose them to potentially harmful spiritual experiences. If you look at the references that they use, they talk about the use of the spirit boards in movies like The Exorcist, which makes people like a little unhinged, like we don't want anything to do with that. Sorry guys, I'm tired today. So if you look at the way that pop culture views spirit boards and witchcraft and the way that they show that within pop culture, whether it be movies, books, TV shows, what have you, well, obviously you're not going to want to have this particular thing being marketed towards children. Probably not a good idea. Not really anyways. And then current modern day philosophies, the psychological perspective, psychologists explain that the movement of the planchette on a spirit board as a result of the idiometer effect, where individuals unconsciously move the pointer due to expectations or beliefs. So from a psychological standpoint, the movement of a planchette on a spirit board really is only going to be chalked up to the idiometer effect. They don't believe that there is a spiritual connection at all. In 1966, the rights to the Ouija board were sold to Parker Brothers, and it later became a subsidiary of Hasbro. And the board is currently, to this day, still being sold and produced by Hasbro. And despite the controversy